The pendulum is often used in diagnosing diseases, and some surprisingly accurate results have been obtained. As I mentioned in the last chapter, the Abbé Bouli was outstanding at this work, except that he used a thick whalebone rod instead of a pendulum. This branch of divining is one which I prefer to avoid, but one occasionally finds oneself involved in circumstances over which one has no control. When I was in Rhodesia, I was out prospecting with a farmer and met with a nasty accident in which my nose was badly injured, and I lost so much blood that I was taken to hospital, where I was treated by a young doctor just out from England. When I was well enough to talk, he told me of an interesting lecture he had heard before leaving England, on the subject of diagnosing diseases with a pendulum. He thought it was a pity that I hadn't heard it too, so I told him that I had often seen it done and, what was more, could do it myself. Thereupon he insisted, despite my objections, on my coming to his surgery as soon as I was well enough and giving a demonstration of how I worked, to see whether my method was the same as the lecturer's. So, a few weeks later he fetched me from my hotel and took me to his surgery, where I found two completely strange young men waiting for me. In diagnosing diseases, I use my pendulum in much the same way as I do when divining water. The pointing finger of the left hand is held a few inches away from the patient, who is never touched during the whole proceedings. I begin by pointing at the patient's forehead, then eyes, mouth, throat, chest and so on, down to the toes. When the finger points at a trouble spot, the gentle oscillation of the pendulum in my right hand turns into a gyration. If the trouble is serious, it jumps about and whirls round madly. One of the young men was my patient. I began by pointing at his forehead and the pendulum went wild. "You must have terrible headaches," I said. "Probably vicious migraine." I could find nothing wrong with his face or throat, but, when I came to his left side, the pendulum whirled round and I felt as though I were being suffocated. I get the reaction on myself from everything I find, which is one reason why I dislike diagnosing diseases. I told him there was something wrong with his left side and went on to the right. There the pendulum jumped about madly, so I told him that his right side was covered with scars. Why I said that I do not know, for I had never seen the pendulum behave quite like that before and the patient was fully dressed. He gave me no indication whether I was right or wrong. "What about my legs?" he asked. I tested them. One seemed all right, but the other affected the pendulum violently and gave me violent pain as well. The doctor then asked the other young man to take me home and took my patient into another room, without giving me any idea whether my diagnosis was correct. I followed the other young man out to the car. He had not spoken a word and smoked a cigarette while I was making my diagnosis, and I had no idea who he was or why he had been in the surgery. Almost immediately after we had started I clapped my hand to my throat, and cried, "Oh, I am in agony. What can have happened to my throat? It's so odd. That man who I have just diagnosed had nothing the matter with his throat." The young man then said in an angry voice, "I suppose you have got my throat." I looked at him seriously. "Young man," I replied, "I have never seen you before, but I know that if you don't stop smoking you will die. And I am not speaking figuratively, but literally." He dumped me down at the hotel and rushed back to the doctor in a furious rage, accusing him of breach of etiquette in telling me what was the matter with him. It was useless for the former to swear that he had never even mentioned him to me nor discussed his case. What I had said to him in the car was precisely what the doctor had told him that morning. He had cancer of the throat from excessive smoking. Next day the doctor came round to tell me all about it. The strangest thing was that I was not even trying to diagnose this silent young man and was not in the least interested in him. The doctor told me that my patient suffered from severe headaches. He had been badly gassed in the First World War, which accounted for my feeling of suffocation when diagnosing his left side. His right side was covered with shrapnel wounds and one of his legs had been badly smashed. He added, "You have indeed a most remarkable gift." Instead of being pleased that my diagnosis in both these cases was correct, it made me more determined than ever to exclude medical divining in my work. Then some years later, a friend begged me to diagnose her, as there was some talk of an abdominal operation. Rather unwillingly, I did. I could find nothing wrong with that part of her anatomy, but there was serious trouble in her ears, nose and right arm. She admitted that her ears and nose had been troubling her, but said that there was certainly nothing the matter with her arm. When next I met her, some months later, she said, "You were just 10 days ahead about my arm. I have hardly been able to use it for months, and massage and the usual things are doing it no good." This made me more than ever determined to have nothing more to do with this branch of divining. I also had no wish to turn myself into a kind of bloodhound and trace missing human corpses. One of the leading diviners to undertake that ghoulish business was a Mr. John Clark, who lived at Melton Mowbray in England, and died recently at the age of 86. He helped the police to trace missing people on many occasions, and is credited with 70 successful results. Once he searched 12 miles along the bank of the River Trent before pointing to where the body of the missing man was discovered. I should mention that the police do not seek the help of diviners until they have exhausted all their ordinary methods. Similarly, a diviner is seldom called in, even to find water, until every other known method has been tried in vain. The usual method employed by a diviner when tracing lost persons is as follows. He first obtains a piece of unwashed clothing which the missing person has worn next his skin, such as a sock or a vest. Part of the garment is then wrapped round the rod or forked stick, this giving the diviner the vibration or ray of the lost person and acting as scent does to a bloodhound. The diviner usually uses the old-fashioned forked stick for this work. The stick is then raised to the level of the forehead and held horizontally, point forward. The diviner turns slowly round and his stick bows in the direction taken by the lost person. He then starts walking in that direction, and is pulled back by the stick if he gets out of line. Where the lost person has stopped on his last journey, the diviner also stops and again turns slowly round with the stick held horizontally in front of his forehead until he again picks up the scent. This procedure continues until the corpse is found. When I first arrived in Australia, during the Second World War, 2 important people from the Criminal Investigation Bureau came to see me in Sydney with a view to getting me to trace criminals in conjunction with another diviner, with whom they were in touch. I was really horrified, and not being very Amazonian in outlook, I tried to point out to them that I hadn't the least wish to end my life at the hands of some desperate criminal. They assured me that they would take every care of me, but I was too frightened to be polite and said, "Oh, for goodness sake, don't talk rot. How in the world could either of you stop a bullet intended for me?" It was finally decided that neither I, nor the other diviner, should be employed, for which I was very thankful. But divining has pleasanter uses than this. Doctors make use of it, especially in France, in testing foods for dyspeptics. The patient puts out his right hand, left if he is left-handed, and the doctor holds a pendulum over it to note the reaction. Samples of foods, sugar, butter, pork, potatoes, eggs, etc., are placed on a table in front of the patient. The doctor takes the radiation from the patient's hand and moves the pendulum, still gyrating, over the sugar. If the pendulum continues to gyrate, sugar is good for the patient. If it gathers momentum, it is very good. If the pendulum dies down and begins to oscillate, sugar will do neither harm nor good, but if it begins to gyrate in the opposite direction, sugar is definitely bad, and its degree of harmfulness will be indicated by the rapidity of the gyration. Other foods are tested in the same way. A similar method is used in agriculture. Suppose a field of wheat is to be sown. A sample of the seed and samples of soil taken from several fields are put into separate receptacles. The pendulum is held over the wheat until it gyrates and is then gently moved, so that the gyration shall not be stopped, over one of the soil samples. If the same gyration continues, the soil will suit the seed. If it increases, it is eminently suitable. If it dies down and the pendulum begins to oscillate, various fertilizers are added to the soil samples until the gyrations over the soil samples are the same as those over the seed. If these fertilizers are then used on the various fields, good crops should result. But if the gyration dies down and the pendulum begins to gyrate in a direction opposite to that when held over the wheat, the seed should on no account be planted in that field, as only poor crops will result. Good results are said to have been obtained, especially in France, by this method. However, one of the most delightful things about possessing the gift of divining is that it opens up so many new channels of interest which otherwise might have remained undiscovered. One is the connection between divining and green fingers. I discovered this quite by accident. I was searching for underground water on a large property by map divining. I was following my usual procedure of putting the map on the table and swinging my little black acorn-shaped pendulum over it to outline the course of the streams, which I then drew in with a pencil. There is a hole in the pendulum through which is passed a string, which I hold between my second finger and thumb. On this particular occasion I noted that there was a bright phosphorescent mist around the tips of my fingers and that it was running down the string to the pendulum, which had become a ball of gleaming silver. I then began to notice that I could see the same phosphorescent mist streaming out of my fingertips when I was planting out seedlings or potting small plants, and I realized that this was what constituted having green fingers. My childish trick of laying my hands on trees to know whether they were friendly to humans or not developed into my healing trees and plants when they were sick and making them grow by gently stroking their stems upwards, never downwards, between the thumb and two fingers. Many people have green fingers and know that anything they plant is almost certain to grow, but few of them know that the same power will heal their ailing plants and trees. Very few people know that green fingers is a phenomenon visible to the naked eye, which can be seen by almost anybody. The simplest way to test it is to hang up a dull black cloth on a door, or on some other convenient spot, and stand with your back to the light, which should not be too bright. Then, hold out your hands close to the black cloth, with the palms towards you and the fingers spread out, your hands being about an inch apart. Then look at your fingers in a dreamy way, as if you were looking at a distant landscape through a window with your thoughts far away. Let your eyes be slightly out of focus. The first thing that you will see will be a steadily thickening mist round the tips of your fingers, from which a phosphorescent ray will emanate. Then put the fingertips of both hands close together without touching, so that the rays of both hands mingle. The hands can then be slowly drawn apart and the rays stretch like a piece of elastic. If the hands are stretched too far, the rays will break, but it's easy to start again and rejoin them. When the green-fingered experimenter can do this, he can turn his attention to sick trees and plants. I had a very convincing demonstration of the reality and power of these rays when I was living in Victoria, British Columbia. An old friend of mine had sold her lovely house and garden and had gone to live in a hotel, but she missed her garden so much she decided to grow pot plants and had a row of cyclamens on her windowsill. They were all growing beautifully and were all perfect specimens, except one which, though strong and healthy, was curiously stunted. If anything, it had more flowers and leaves than the others, but they all lacked height. Knowing that I had some, what she called, funny gifts, my friend listened with great interest when I told her about how to heal plants and make them grow, and readily accepted my offer to see whether I could do anything to make the plant increase in height and catch up with the others. So I put my hands over the flower pot, like a cap, with my fingers slightly spread out and pointing downwards. I could see the phosphorescent rays pouring out of my fingertips, and I kept slowly raising my hands and quietly telling the flowers and leaves to grow. When I took my departure, I left a very grateful and much impressed friend, expecting great things from the experiment. Next morning, she telephoned very early, no longer grateful or impressed. In a furious voice she said, "You've killed my plant. It is drooping and flat, just as though it had been dug up and put out in the scorching sun." Being only half awake, I crossly answered, "Don't be so silly. Give the plant some water," to which she replied that she had done so and everything else she could think of. The very least she said I could do was to go over and see for myself, which I eventually did. What she said was quite true. The plant was dead. Apparently, I had given it too much of whatever it was. I was terribly sorry that I had killed the plant, but I also felt that here was absolute proof that in my hands I possessed a power, which could dominate the vegetable kingdom for good or ill. When the green-fingered has proved his ability to heal plants, he should experiment on birds, whose natures are closely connected with the flowers and the trees in which they live. Francis Thompson voices this delightfully when he says, "The brilliant liquid song of birds doth the flower buds open, and there is an ancient belief among the Persians that the bulbul nightingale only sings near the budding rose." One of India's leading scientists and possibly the world's leading botanist was Jagdish Chandra Bose, who gave the gardeners of the world an entirely new outlook on flowers. He perfected several most delicate instruments by which he claimed to demonstrate the indivisible unity of all life. He also proved to the satisfaction of many scientific bodies that the vital mechanism of a plant is similar to that of an animal, in that the sap movement in vegetation corresponds to blood pressure. Perhaps his most interesting discovery in the plant world, made by means of one of his chief inventions called a cruciograph, was that plants have a nervous system and emotional life. According to him, love, hate, fear, pleasure and pain are as universal in plants as in animals. Who knows, but when we walk down a garden path and admire this plant and condemn that, the plants themselves may be doing the same to us. Chandra Bose also declared that he had successfully moved huge forest trees by chloroforming them first. This remarkable man was educated at Cambridge University and was knighted in 1917. It would be interesting to know whether he had the divining gift, for I can find no record of it. End of Part 13.